The Vietnam War ended in 1975, but the official story never actually started. What most people remember as confusion was often deliberate. What looked like failure was sometimes reported as progress. What felt wrong to the people who were there was classified as operational complexity. The gap between what happened and what was written down wasn't an accident of war. It was how the war was fought. From the beginning, Vietnam was a conflict where the measurements mattered more than the mission, where the reports outlasted the truth, and where the people sent to fight it were handed objectives that dissolved the moment they tried to complete them. This isn't about hidden atrocities or dramatic cover-ups. It's about something harder to define. A war that kept going because no one could agree on what winning looked like. And by the time that became obvious, too many people had already decided the story couldn't change. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964 gave the United States legal justification to escalate military involvement in Vietnam. What the public was told at the time was that North Vietnamese forces launched unprovoked attacks on American destroyers in international waters. What actually happened was more ambiguous. The first attack on August 2nd involved an engagement that did occur, though the circumstances leading to it were far from clear-cut. The second attack, reported on August 4th, likely never happened. Sailors on the USS Maddox reported torpedo attacks and enemy vessel sightings during a night of poor weather and high tension. Sonar readings were misinterpreted. Radio intercepts were mistranslated. Commander John Herrick, who was on scene, sent a message urging caution and recommending a thorough review before any retaliation. That message was noted, but not prioritized. President Johnson addressed the nation hours later and launched retaliatory airstrikes. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution 2 days after that, granting the executive branch broad authority to use military force in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. The resolution passed with near unanimity. Only 2 senators voted against it. Years later, declassified documents and testimony from personnel involved made it clear that the evidence for the second attack was weak at best. But by then, tens of thousands of American troops were already on the ground. The legal framework for the war had been built on an event that probably didn't happen, and no one in a position to correct the record had an incentive to do so. Once American forces began deploying in large numbers, the Pentagon needed a way to measure progress. Traditional metrics didn't work. There were no front lines. There were no territories to capture and hold in the conventional sense. The enemy didn't wear uniforms. They controlled villages during the day and disappeared into the jungle at night. So the military turned to body counts. If you couldn't measure success by land taken, you could measure it by enemy dead. Every unit in the field was expected to report how many Viet Cong or North Vietnamese soldiers they had killed. Those numbers were compiled, analyzed, and sent up the chain of command. They appeared in briefings in Saigon and Washington. They were used to justify continued operations and requests for more troops. The problem was that body counts were almost never accurate. There was no reliable way to distinguish a dead Viet Cong fighter from a dead civilian in many cases. After a firefight in dense jungle, bodies were often left behind and not inspected closely. Sometimes they were counted from a distance. Sometimes they were estimated based on how much firepower had been used. Commanders were under pressure to report high numbers. Units that reported low body counts were seen as ineffective. Units that reported high body counts received recognition and resources. The incentive structure guaranteed inflation. Soldiers in the field knew the numbers were inflated. Officers who compiled the reports knew the numbers were inflated. Analysts in Saigon knew the numbers were inflated. But the numbers kept being used because there wasn't an alternative that fit the narrative of progress. The war became a statistical exercise that measured something other than reality, and everyone involved understood that. But no one wanted to be the person who said it out loud. Free fire zones were areas where anyone present was considered an enemy combatant. These zones were established in regions where the military believed civilian populations had been evacuated or were predominantly hostile. The rules of engagement in a free fire zone allowed soldiers to shoot without needing to confirm a threat first. The logic was that it reduced hesitation and increased operational efficiency. The reality was that free-fire zones expanded over time, and civilians didn't always know where the boundaries were. They didn't always have the ability to leave, even if they did know. Rural farmers whose families had lived in the same area for generations were sometimes told to relocate with little notice and few resources. Many didn't leave. Some didn't hear the warnings. Some didn't believe them. Some had nowhere else to go. When American patrols encountered people inside free-fire zones, they followed their orders. The paperwork would later classify those deaths as enemy combatants eliminated in a designated combat zone. There were no investigations unless someone outside the unit raised questions, and that rarely happened. The soldiers who carried out these orders were not acting outside the scope of their authority. They were following the rules that had been written for them. The confusion came later when they tried to reconcile what they had done with what they had been told the war was about. That confusion didn't make it into the reports. The reports just recorded the numbers and moved on. Operation Ranch Hand began in 1962 and continued until 1971. Its purpose was to deny the enemy cover and destroy crops that might be used to feed Viet Cong forces. American aircraft sprayed millions of gallons of herbicide over rural Vietnam. The most commonly used chemical was Agent Orange, a mixture that contained dioxin, one of the most toxic substances ever created by industrial processes. The military was aware that the herbicide was strong. What they claimed not to know was how toxic it would be to human beings over time. Soldiers who handled Agent Orange were not given protective equipment in the early years of the program. They loaded barrels onto planes without gloves. They walked through sprayed areas during operations. They drank water from contaminated sources. Vietnamese civilians lived in the sprayed zones. They farmed the soil. They ate the crops that survived. Their children played in areas that had been drenched in chemicals. The effects were not immediate, which made it easier to ignore the connection when health problems appeared years later. American veterans started reporting skin conditions, cancers, neurological disorders, and birth defects in their children. Vietnamese communities reported the same patterns, but on a larger scale. The military's official position for years was that there was no proven link between Agent Orange and these health outcomes. Proving causation was difficult because the effects were delayed and diffuse. It wasn't until the 1990s that the United States government formally recognized certain conditions as connected to Agent Orange exposure for American veterans. Even then, the recognition was limited. Vietnamese civilians were not included in that acknowledgement. The program itself was not classified as a mistake. It was described as an operational choice that had unintended side effects. The language mattered. If something is unintended, no one is responsible. The herbicide was sprayed. The consequences unfolded. The official record moved on. The Phoenix program was a counterinsurgency operation run by the CIA with support from American military forces and South Vietnamese security agencies. Its stated goal was to identify and neutralize Viet Cong infrastructure. Neutralize was the preferred term. What it meant in practice was capture, interrogate, or kill individuals suspected of supporting the Viet Cong. The program relied on intelligence gathered from informants, interrogations, and surveillance. The quality of that intelligence varied widely. In some cases, people were targeted because of personal grudges, local disputes, or false accusations. Once someone was identified as a suspected Viet Cong operative, they were detained and interrogated. Interrogation methods included torture, electric shocks, waterboarding, beatings, and stress positions were used regularly. The people conducting these interrogations were not rogue actors. They were following protocols that had been developed, refined, and approved at high levels. Some of the interrogations took place at provincial interrogation centers that were funded and equipped by the United States. American advisors were often present. The information extracted under torture was unreliable, but it was still used to justify further operations. The Phoenix program claimed to have neutralized tens of thousands of Viet Cong operatives over the course of several years. Internal documents later suggested that a significant portion of those killed were not actually members of the Viet Cong. They were civilians caught in a system that prioritized results over accuracy. When the program was investigated by Congress in the 1970s, the official response was that while some abuses may have occurred, the program itself was a necessary component of the war effort. The word abuses was used carefully. It suggested deviation from a standard, rather than the standard itself being the problem. The Phoenix program continued until the American withdrawal. The people who were detained, tortured, or killed during its operations were not included in most public discussions of the war. They existed in the classified sections of reports that were never meant to be read widely. My Lai was not an isolated incident. It became the most well-known massacre of Vietnamese civilians by American forces, because a helicopter pilot named Hugh Thompson intervened to stop it, because a journalist named Seymour Hersh investigated it, and because photographs taken by an army photographer named Ronald Haberle made it impossible to ignore. On March 16, 1968, members of Charlie Company entered the village of My Lai during a search and destroy mission. They had been told the village was a Viet Cong stronghold. They encountered no armed resistance. Over the course of several hours, they killed more than 500 civilians, mostly women, children, and elderly men. They burned homes. They killed livestock. They destroyed food supplies. Some of the soldiers participated actively. Some stood by. Some were ordered to participate and did. Hugh Thompson, flying a reconnaissance helicopter above the village, saw what was happening and landed his aircraft between a group of fleeing civilians and advancing American soldiers. He ordered his door gunner to fire on the American troops if they tried to harm the civilians. He radioed for help and managed to evacuate some survivors. His actions were not celebrated at the time. He was treated with hostility by many in his unit and his superiors. The massacre was covered up initially. The army reported that 128 Viet Cong had been killed in a successful operation. It wasn't until a year later, after a veteran named Ron Ridenhour sent letters to Congress and the Pentagon detailing what he had heard from soldiers who were there, that an investigation was opened. Even then, the investigation was narrow. Only one officer, Lieutenant William Calley, was convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison, but his sentence was reduced multiple times. He served 3.5 years under house arrest. The other men involved were either not charged or acquitted. The official narrative after My Lai was that it was an aberration, a breakdown in discipline rather than a reflection of how the war was being conducted. But soldiers who served in Vietnam recognized the structure that made My Lai possible. Free fire zones, body count pressure, unclear rules of engagement, and the dehumanization of the population they were supposed to be protecting all contributed to an environment where something like My Lai could happen. And it did happen in other places. Smaller massacres, ones that didn't have a Hugh Thompson or a Seymour Hersh, occurred throughout the war. Most were never investigated. Some were reported internally and ignored. Others were never reported at all. The villagers who were killed are not counted in most official tallies of the war. They appear in footnotes if they appear at all. Drug use among American soldiers in Vietnam escalated as the war continued. Marijuana was common early on. Heroin became widespread by the late 1960s. The heroin available in Southeast Asia was highly pure and inexpensive. Soldiers used it to cope with the stress of combat, the boredom of waiting, and the realization that the war had no clear purpose. Some estimates suggest that by 1971, around 20% of American soldiers in Vietnam had tried heroin, and a significant portion of those were using it regularly. The military's official response to the drug problem was inconsistent. Early in the war, drug use was largely ignored unless it interfered directly with operations. As the scale of the problem became undeniable, the response shifted to punishment, then to treatment programs that were poorly funded and implemented too late. Soldiers caught using drugs faced court-martial, dishonorable discharge, or informal punishment within their units. But enforcement was uneven. Officers looked the other way in some cases, especially if the soldiers involved were otherwise effective. The drug use wasn't just about escape. It was also a symptom of collapsing morale. By the time Nixon began withdrawing troops, many soldiers saw the war as already lost. They were being asked to risk their lives for objectives that had been quietly abandoned. Drug use was one way to tolerate that reality. When veterans returned to the United States, many were still struggling with addiction. The VA system was not equipped to handle the scale of the problem. Treatment options were limited. Stigma was high. Many veterans ended up incarcerated or homeless. The official narrative focused on individual responsibility and poor choices. The systemic issues that contributed to the drug epidemic in Vietnam, the lack of purpose, the breakdown of command trust, the knowledge that the war was unwinnable while still being asked to fight it, were not discussed in depth. Veterans carried that weight privately. Some still do. Fragging was the practice of soldiers killing or attempting to kill their own officers, usually with fragmentation grenades, which left little forensic evidence and were difficult to trace. The term became widely used during the Vietnam War because the practice became disturbingly common. Between 1969 and 1972, the Pentagon recorded more than 800 fragging incidents. The actual number was almost certainly higher because not all cases were reported or recognized as fraggings. Some were classified as accidental deaths or missing persons. Fraggings typically occurred when soldiers believed an officer was needlessly risking their lives, enforcing discipline too harshly, or pushing for aggressive action in a war that most soldiers no longer believed in. Officers who insisted on risky patrols, who demanded strict adherence to procedures that seemed pointless, or who were seen as chasing promotions through body counts, became targets. In some units, warnings were issued first. A smoke grenade might be thrown into an officer's tent as a message. If the behavior didn't change, a live grenade might follow. The act of fragging represented a complete breakdown of military cohesion. It meant that soldiers trusted each other more than they trusted their leaders, and that they were willing to kill those leaders to protect themselves. The military's response was to prosecute when they could, but convictions were rare. Witnesses were hard to find. Evidence was scarce. Soldiers closed ranks. The broader problem, that many troops had stopped believing in the mission and saw their officers as obstacles to survival rather than leaders, was not addressed in any meaningful way. Fragging was treated as a criminal issue rather than a symptom of systemic failure. When veterans talked about Vietnam in later years, fragging was one of the topics that revealed how far the war had deteriorated. It wasn't just that soldiers were fighting the enemy. In some cases, they were fighting each other. The bombing of Cambodia began in secret in March 1969 under the code name Operation Menu. President Nixon and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger authorized the bombing campaign to target North Vietnamese supply routes and base camps located inside Cambodian territory. Cambodia was officially neutral. The bombings were not reported to Congress or the American public. Pilots were instructed to falsify their reports, claiming they had bombed sites inside South Vietnam when they had actually struck targets in Cambodia. The operation expanded over time. Between 1969 and 1973, American forces dropped more than 2.5 million tons of bombs on Cambodia. That's more tonnage than was dropped on Japan during all of World War II. The bombing devastated rural areas. Entire villages were destroyed. Tens of thousands of Cambodian civilians were killed. The agricultural economy collapsed in many regions. The social and political structures that held Cambodia together were shattered. The bombing contributed directly to the rise of the Khmer Rouge, a radical communist movement that gained support, in part because of anger over the American bombing campaign. When the Khmer Rouge took power in 1975, they enacted one of the most brutal genocides of the 20th century, killing approximately 2 million people. The connection between American actions and the conditions that enabled the Khmer Rouge is well documented, but it remains uncomfortable to discuss in official histories of the war. The bombing of Cambodia was illegal under international law and under the framework of American constitutional authority because it was conducted without congressional approval and kept secret from the public. When the operation was finally revealed in 1973, there was outrage. But by then the war was winding down, and the appetite for accountability was limited. Nixon and Kissinger faced no legal consequences. The official justification was that the bombing was a necessary measure to protect American lives and disrupt enemy logistics. The civilian casualties were described as regrettable, but unavoidable. The long-term consequences in Cambodia were not included in the calculus. The Cambodian incursion in 1970 was different from the secret bombing because it was public. Nixon announced that American and South Vietnamese forces would cross into Cambodia to attack North Vietnamese bases and supply depots. The operation was framed as a limited action that would shorten the war by cutting off enemy resources. It lasted 2 months. American forces captured large amounts of weapons, ammunition, and supplies. They also killed an unknown number of enemy fighters and civilians. The incursion did not shorten the war. It expanded it. It destabilized Cambodia further, strengthening the Khmer Rouge and pushing the country deeper into chaos. In the United States, the announcement of the incursion triggered widespread protests. College campuses erupted. On May 4, 1970, National Guard troops fired on student protesters at Kent State University in Ohio, killing 4 students and wounding 9 others. The images of the Kent State shooting galvanized anti-war sentiment and deepened the divide in American society. Nixon's approval ratings dropped. Congressional opposition to the war intensified. But the incursion continued until the planned withdrawal date. The operation was declared a success based on the material captured. The broader strategic failure, that the war had now officially spread into a neighboring country and that American credibility was eroding domestically and internationally, was not emphasized in official assessments. The Cambodian incursion became another example of how tactical objectives were prioritized over strategic coherence. The mission was completed. The war got worse. Christmas bombing in December 1972 was the largest aerial bombardment campaign since World War II. It was officially called Operation Linebacker II. The goal was to force North Vietnam back to the negotiating table after peace talks had stalled. American B-52 bombers flew around the clock for 11 days, dropping tens of thousands of tons of explosives on Hanoi, Haiphong, and other targets in North Vietnam. The bombing was intended to demonstrate American resolve. What it demonstrated was desperation. The North Vietnamese had already endured years of bombing. They had adapted. They had built extensive air defenses. During Operation Linebacker II, North Vietnam shot down 15 B-52 bombers, a significant loss rate that shocked American planners. More than 90 American airmen were killed or captured during the campaign. The bombing did bring North Vietnam back to the negotiating table, but the terms of the agreement signed in January 1973 were nearly identical to the terms that had been on the table before the bombing began. The Paris Peace Accords allowed North Vietnamese forces to remain in South Vietnam. They allowed the war to continue without American involvement. Nixon called it peace with honor. What it actually was a face-saving withdrawal. American troops left Vietnam. North Vietnam waited. 2 years later, they launched a final offensive and took Saigon. The Christmas bombing killed an estimated 1,600 civilians in Hanoi and surrounding areas. Hospitals, residential neighborhoods, and infrastructure were hit. The North Vietnamese government used the bombing as propaganda, showing the world what American firepower looked like when turned on a city. Internationally, the bombing was condemned, even by some American allies. Domestically, it deepened opposition to the war. The strategic value of the operation was negligible. The human cost was high. The official record describes it as a successful application of air power that achieved its objective. The objective was to leave. The fall of Saigon in April 1975 happened faster than almost anyone expected. The Paris Peace Accords had been signed 2 years earlier, and American forces had withdrawn. South Vietnam was left to defend itself with American equipment, training, and promises of continued support. That support never came. When North Vietnamese forces launched their final offensive in early 1975, the South Vietnamese military collapsed. Unit after unit disintegrated. Soldiers abandoned their positions. Officers fled. The government in Saigon lost control. As North Vietnamese forces closed in on the capital, American personnel and some South Vietnamese allies were evacuated by helicopter from the roof of the American embassy and other locations around the city. The images of helicopters lifting off while desperate people tried to grab onto the landing skids became the defining visual of the war's end. Tens of thousands of South Vietnamese who had worked with the Americans were left behind. Many were sent to re-education camps, which were prisons in all but name. Some were held for years. Some died there. The American government made no effort to evacuate most of the people who had risked their lives based on American promises. The official explanation was that the collapse happened too quickly. The reality was that there was no political will to do more. The war was over. America had lost. No one wanted to dwell on the details. The people who were left behind were evidence of how completely the mission had failed. And evidence like that was easier to ignore than confront. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not officially recognized as a diagnosis until 1980, 5 years after the war ended. Before that, the psychological damage experienced by Vietnam veterans was often dismissed as weakness, character flaws, or failure to adjust. Veterans who came home with nightmares, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, and rage had no framework to understand what was happening to them. The VA system was not prepared to treat them. Many were told there was nothing wrong with them. Some were given medication and sent away. Others were institutionalized. The lack of recognition made everything worse. Veterans felt isolated, ashamed, and abandoned by the country that had sent them to war. Suicide rates among Vietnam veterans were significantly higher than the general population, a pattern that persists today. Drug addiction, homelessness, incarceration, and broken families were common outcomes for men who had served and come back damaged. The absence of a diagnosis meant there was no accountability and no acknowledgement that the war itself had caused these problems. When PTSD was finally recognized, it helped some veterans get treatment. But the recognition came too late for many, and the VA remained underfunded and overwhelmed. The official narrative was that the country had learned from Vietnam and would do better for future veterans. That promise has been tested repeatedly, and the results have been mixed. What didn't change was the underlying issue. Wars produce psychological casualties on a massive scale. Those casualties are inconvenient for governments that want to maintain public support for military action. So the recognition and treatment of those casualties is always slower and less comprehensive than it should be. Veterans returning from Vietnam were not welcomed home as heroes. There were no parades for most of them. There was no collective sense of gratitude. The war was unpopular. The veterans were associated with the war. Many people who opposed the war saw the veterans as complicit, even though most of them had been drafted and had no choice in the matter. Some veterans were spat on, though the frequency of that happening has been debated. What's not debated is that the reception was cold. Veterans were told to move on, to forget about it, to be grateful they had survived. They were not asked what they had seen or done. They were not given space to process the experience. The military discharged them and sent them home with minimal transition support. Many went from active combat to civilian life in a matter of days. The psychological whiplash was severe. Veterans learned not to talk about the war. They learned that people didn't want to hear about it. They learned that their service was not valued and might even be seen as shameful. That silence compounded the trauma. The absence of social recognition for their service made it harder to integrate what they had experienced into a coherent sense of identity. Many veterans felt like they had been used and discarded. That feeling was not irrational. It was an accurate reading of how the country treated them. When the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was dedicated in 1982, it was controversial because the design was stark and non-triumphalist. It listed names without commentary. Some people wanted a memorial that honored the sacrifice and valor of the soldiers. Others felt that any memorial would glorify an unjust war. The compromise was a wall of names. It became one of the most visited memorials in the country. Veterans go there to find the names of people they knew. They touch the stone. They leave things behind. The memorial acknowledges loss without trying to justify it. That restraint makes it powerful, but it doesn't change the fact that for most veterans, the return home was marked by indifference or hostility. The war ended for the country when the last troops left. For the people who fought it, the war never really ended. The Pentagon Papers were a classified Department of Defense study of American involvement in Vietnam from 1945 to 1967. The study was commissioned by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who had begun to doubt the official narrative of the war. The papers revealed that successive administrations had systematically lied to Congress and the public about the scope, progress, and prospects of the war. They showed that the government knew the war was unwinnable far earlier than they admitted. They documented decisions to escalate the conflict, even when internal assessments predicted failure. Daniel Ellsberg, a military analyst who had worked on the study, leaked the papers to the New York Times in 1971. The Nixon administration sought an injunction to prevent publication, citing national security concerns. The case went to the Supreme Court, which ruled in favor of the press. The Pentagon Papers were published. The revelations damaged what little remained of public trust in the government's handling of the war. They confirmed what many people had suspected, that the war had been prosecuted based on false premises and sustained through deception. The official response was to attack Ellsberg rather than address the content of the papers. He was charged under the Espionage Act. The charges were later dismissed due to government misconduct, including an illegal break-in at his psychiatrist's office. The Pentagon Papers did not end the war. The war continued for 4 more years after their publication, but they made it impossible to maintain the pretense that the government had been honest. The gap between the official story and the truth had been documented in the government's own words. That gap didn't close. It just became visible. Agent Orange exposure affected an estimated 3 million Vietnamese civilians and hundreds of thousands of American veterans. The effects included cancers, liver damage, respiratory disorders, nerve damage, and severe birth defects in children born to exposed individuals. The birth defects were particularly devastating. Children born with spina bifida, cleft palates, missing limbs, and severe cognitive impairments. The chemical contamination persisted in the environment long after the spraying stopped. Dioxin breaks down very slowly. Soil and water sources in heavily sprayed areas remained contaminated for decades. Vietnamese families continued to suffer health effects from exposure that happened during the war. The American government's response was limited to acknowledging certain conditions in American veterans. Even that acknowledgement was slow and incomplete. Veterans had to fight for years to get their illnesses recognized and covered by VA benefits. Many died before they received any assistance. Vietnamese civilians received no compensation and no acknowledgement from the United States. The companies that manufactured Agent Orange, including Monsanto and Dow Chemical, settled a lawsuit brought by American veterans in 1984 for $180 million, a fraction of what the long-term care for affected individuals would cost. The settlement did not include any admission of wrongdoing. The corporations maintained that they had fulfilled government contracts and had no independent liability. Vietnamese victims filed their own lawsuits, which were dismissed by American courts on the grounds that the herbicide spraying was a military action and therefore immune from litigation. The legal framework protected the government and the manufacturers. The people who were poisoned had no recourse. Agent Orange remains one of the most visible long-term consequences of the war, but it's treated as a historical footnote rather than an ongoing crisis. The chemicals are still in the ground. The children are still being born with defects. The official narrative moved on decades ago. The secret war in Laos ran parallel to the Vietnam War and was even less visible to the American public. The United States was prohibited by international agreement from having military forces in Laos, so the CIA ran the operation instead. They recruited and trained a proxy army made up largely of Hmong tribespeople. The Hmong fought against communist Pathet Lao forces and North Vietnamese troops using Laotian territory for supply routes. American pilots flew bombing missions over Laos. Between 1964 and 1973, the United States dropped more than 2 million tons of bombs on Laos, making it the most heavily bombed country per capita in history. Much of the bombing targeted the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of supply routes running through Laotian territory. The bombing was indiscriminate. Villages were destroyed. Civilians were killed in large numbers. Around 30% of the bombs dropped on Laos did not detonate. They remained in the ground as unexploded ordnance. Decades later, people in Laos are still being killed and injured by bombs left over from a war that was never officially declared. Farmers plowing fields hit bombs. Children playing find cluster munitions that look like toys. The clearance effort is slow and underfunded. The United States has provided some assistance for unexploded ordnance removal, but it represents a tiny fraction of the cost required to clear the country. The Hmong people who fought for the CIA were abandoned when the war ended. Many were killed by the Pathet Lao in retaliation. Others fled to refugee camps in Thailand. Some eventually resettled in the United States, but the process took years, and many were left behind. The secret war in Laos was not acknowledged officially until long after it ended. The people who fought it and the people who suffered from it were erased from the official history. The bombs are still there. American POWs held by North Vietnam were used as propaganda tools and subjected to torture and abuse. The most well-known facility was Hoa Lo Prison in Hanoi, which American prisoners sarcastically called the Hanoi Hilton. Prisoners were beaten, placed in stress positions, held in solitary confinement for extended periods, and denied medical care. The goal was to extract confessions and statements that could be used for propaganda purposes. Some prisoners complied under torture. Some resisted. The Code of Conduct expected prisoners to resist to the point of death, but that expectation was not realistic given the conditions. When POWs were released in 1973 as part of the Paris Peace Accords, they came home to a complicated reception. They were celebrated as heroes, which was a stark contrast to how other veterans were treated. The POWs became symbols of American suffering and resilience. Their stories were used to justify the war retroactively, to argue that the sacrifice had meaning. But the focus on POWs also served another purpose. It allowed the country to center American suffering while ignoring the much larger scale of Vietnamese suffering. The POWs were real people who endured real trauma. Their treatment was brutal and unjustifiable. But the way their stories were used in the years after the war was selective. They became proof that America had been the victim, that the war had been fought honorably, that the enemy was barbaric. That narrative required ignoring everything else. The POWs fit into a story that the country wanted to tell. The rest of the war did not. The herbicide spraying program destroyed an estimated 5 million acres of forest and 500,000 acres of crops. The environmental damage was catastrophic. Entire ecosystems were wiped out. Species that depended on dense forest cover disappeared. The mangrove forests in the Mekong Delta, which had provided critical coastal protection and supported fishing communities, were devastated. The loss of the mangroves made the region more vulnerable to storms and erosion. Agricultural land was poisoned. Farmers could not grow crops in sprayed areas for years. The economic impact on rural communities was severe. People who had lived off the land for generations were displaced. The food supply was disrupted. Malnutrition and starvation increased in affected areas. The environmental recovery has been slow and incomplete. Some areas have reforested naturally, but the new growth is different from what was there before. The diversity is lower. The soil quality is poorer. The long-term ecological consequences of the spraying are still unfolding. The official justification for the program was military necessity. The forests provided cover for the enemy. The crops fed enemy forces. Destroying those resources was described as a legitimate tactic. The scale of the destruction and the long-term consequences were not factored into the decision-making. Environmental impact was not a consideration. The focus was operational. The results were recorded. The damage was permanent. No one was held accountable. The war created millions of refugees. People fled combat zones, bombing campaigns, forced relocations, and political persecution. Refugee camps formed in South Vietnam and in neighboring countries. The camps were overcrowded, unsanitary, and dangerous. Disease spread quickly. Food and water were scarce. Children grew up in the camps. Families were separated. Many refugees spent years in limbo, unable to return home and unable to resettle elsewhere. When Saigon fell in 1975, another wave of refugees fled Vietnam by boat. These boat people faced storms, piracy, starvation, and drowning. Tens of thousands died at sea. Those who survived reached refugee camps in Thailand, Malaysia, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. The camps were not welcoming. Host countries saw the refugees as a burden. Resettlement was slow. Some refugees waited in camps for more than a decade. The United States accepted hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese refugees, but the process was selective. Priority was given to people who had worked directly with the American military or government. Many others were left behind. The refugee crisis was a direct result of American involvement in the war, but it was treated as a separate issue. The responsibility for addressing it was diffused. International organizations, host countries, and resettlement programs all played a role, but none of them were adequate to the scale of the problem. The refugees were evidence of the war's failure. They were people whose lives had been destroyed by decisions made in Washington and Saigon. Acknowledging that would have required acknowledging the full scope of the damage. It was easier to treat the refugee crisis as a humanitarian issue rather than a consequence of policy. The distinction allowed the architects of the war to avoid responsibility. The refugees carried the cost. The South Vietnamese government was never stable. It was propped up by American money, equipment, and political support. It was riddled with corruption. Officials diverted aid for personal gain. Military officers sold weapons and supplies on the black market. Land reform programs that might have gained popular support were never implemented because they threatened the interests of the elites who controlled the government. The lack of legitimacy was obvious to everyone involved. American officials privately described the South Vietnamese government as ineffective and corrupt, but publicly insisted it was a vital ally defending freedom. The contradiction was unsustainable. The more the United States supported the government, the more obvious it became that the government could not stand on its own. By the early 1970s, it was clear that South Vietnam would collapse without American military presence. The Paris Peace Accords allowed the United States to withdraw while maintaining the fiction that South Vietnam was viable. It was not. When North Vietnam launched its final offensive in 1975, the South Vietnamese military fell apart in weeks. The government fled. The state ceased to exist. The entire project, which had cost billions of dollars and tens of thousands of American lives, collapsed as soon as American support was removed. The official explanation was that South Vietnam had been betrayed, that Congress had cut off aid, that the North Vietnamese had violated the peace agreement. All of that was true, but it was also irrelevant. The South Vietnamese government had never been capable of governing or defending the country. That fact had been known from the beginning. The war had been fought to prevent a collapse that was inevitable. When it finally happened, the people who had made the decisions that led to that outcome were no longer in office. They wrote memoirs defending their choices. They argued that the war had been winnable if only it had been fought differently. The evidence suggested otherwise. The war had been lost before it started because the objective was impossible. You cannot build a stable state on a foundation of corruption and foreign dependence. The attempt to do so in South Vietnam consumed a generation and achieved nothing. The herbicide program, the bombing campaigns, the body count metrics, the Phoenix program, the secret wars, the free fire zones, the massacres that were investigated and the ones that were not. The drug use, the fragging, the PTSD that was not recognized, the refugees who were created and abandoned, the veterans who came home to nothing, the soldiers who did not come home at all, the lies told to justify escalation and the lies told to justify withdrawal, the people who made the decisions and the people who carried them out and the people who suffered the consequences, none of it added up to a coherent strategy. It was a war prosecuted without a clear definition of success, sustained by metrics that measured nothing meaningful, and ended without achieving any of its stated objectives. The official record describes the Vietnam War as a complex conflict with many lessons. The lessons are usually framed in terms of tactics, strategy, or communication. The deeper lesson, that a war fought for unclear purposes with unreliable information and shifting goals will inevitably corrode the institutions and people involved in fighting it, is less often emphasized. That lesson is harder to integrate into future planning because it suggests that some wars should not be fought at all. The Vietnam War continued long after the people fighting it stopped believing in it. Orders were still given. Missions were still flown. Patrols were still conducted. People still died. The machinery of war kept running because no one with the authority to stop it was willing to accept the political cost of admitting it had been a mistake. So it continued, and when it finally ended, the people responsible moved on. The soldiers, the civilians, the landscape, the children born with defects, the bombs still in the ground, they did not move on. They are still there.